Having looked at Egypt in the last video, let's now look at the other countries in North Africa: Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. And those further south we will cover in a later video. The distinct feature about this region now is that, as with the other countries that we already discussed, they were nominally part of the Ottoman Empire. Although the links, the actual links of governance between the Ottoman center and these countries were even more remote than we already discussed with Egypt. The area under consideration now falls under the political influence of European powers in the 19th century. And let's begin in the West. If we look at Morocco, Morocco has an established dynasty there. There is a local governance that exists. And as the country now falls under the joint influence of Spanish and French troops, the monarchy continues to exist. Here in this picture we see Spanish troops during the colonial subjugation of Morocco. So for Morocco, it's important to remember that the dynasty as it existed continues to function under colonial strictures. But we see a continuation of a continuity of state structures and forms from pre-colonial to colonial to post-independence times. That's the important thing about Morocco. Algeria is more complicated because when the French arrive in Algeria in 1830, they replace the local governance that exists. And in 1848, they completely annex the territory and make it, according to the dominant colonial dogma at the time, a part of mainland France. So Algeria was not seen as merely a colonial possession, but an integral part of the homeland, with a very strong emphasis on settlement, something that we will discuss later in this video. So this colonial dogma of Algeria being part of France dramatically complicated the struggle and the negotiations for independence that we will discuss in a few minutes. Tunisia is more like Morocco in the sense that local governance structures were perpetuated by the French authorities, and Tunisia was more seen as a colonial possession, not as was not annexed formally. It becomes a French protectorate in 1881, which means that the local bey there, the local ruler, continued under French protection. Italy becomes interested in acquiring colonial possessions in the 19th century. Italy is a latecomer to the whole national consolidation. If you might know that Italy as a nation state only begins to exist in the mid-19th century, and therefore it's a latecomer to the colonial game, so it has to content itself with what is left in the world in possible colonial possessions. And so it eyes Libya, that is just across the Mediterranean. And here in this picture we see an Italian soldier in the Italian campaign, and they quickly try to subjugate Libya and turn it into a settler colony alongside the French model in Algeria. And so here we see a pattern that both combines and distinguishes these territories. The level of colonial settlement, i.e. the transfer of European populations into North Africa, varies dramatically in these four countries. And it complicates the already fairly complex ethnic distribution that exists in each country. We are not dealing with homogeneous populations. All four countries are characterized by relatively strong ethnic divisions that exist, and these ethnic divisions are now complicated by the arrival of very large numbers of European settlers. The dominant ethnic division that you should remember in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia is the Berber-Arab divide, which is both linguistic and ethnic and cultural. Something that plays out in the way colonial administrations use these divisions to separate the potential opposition and to divide and rule. And so we see that in the ethnic divisions that exist in the countries are now exploited by the colonial powers. In Libya, the situation is less ethnic than tribal, but there also we see a strong heterogeneous populations. As you see here in this photo, it shows French settlers arriving in North Africa, and the numbers of settlers is very different. So we see in Morocco between 1912 and 1956, about 500,000 Europeans are settled. In Algeria, the numbers are even larger. It's altogether it's about 1.5 million Europeans who are settled permanently in Algeria during the period. In Tunisia, it's about 250,000. And in Libya, reflecting the weakness of the Italian state, the numbers of settlers are less, but it's also, we're talking about 150,000 Italians that are now transposed to Libya and trying to do agriculture. And this arrival of European settlers into these countries is, as you can easily imagine, leads to the dispossession of native populations from their lands through a variety of administrative and legal tools that the colonial forces impose. And there's no mincing of words here. We're talking a very brutal exploitation and dispossession of very large sections of the local populations who become literally landless and impoverished through this process. And their landed wealth is given to ethnically different, religiously different, linguistically different European settlers who have just arrived. And the parallels to the 20th century are obvious. So remember, this dispossession of local populations for foreign settlers is one of the determining characteristics of the way the nationalist struggle plays out in all four countries, and it's particularly pronounced in Algeria. Another aspect worth remembering is that the colonial powers try to use the resources available in these countries for their own purpose. One of these resources is simply manpower, obviously for economic activities, but as you can see on this picture, they very heavily recruited soldiers for the war effort, particularly in the First World War and in the Second World War. And we will return to this issue later, but it's important to remember that both Morocco and Algeria in particular paid a very heavy price in manpower during both world wars as colonial troops under French authority. And that's something that the British also did in their colonial possessions. Particularly with respect to French colonialism in North Africa, it's important to realize the extreme degree of social connection that exists now through the presence of these very large numbers of colonial settlers and a very close geographical proximity to the mainland, or the motherland as the colonials would like to phrase it. And if you, for example, if you read L'Étrangère, The Stranger by Albert Camus, that is not at all dealing with the colonial situation as such, but it's a story set in Algeria. And if you read the story, you realize how closely French society had become embedded in Algerian society. And if you read carefully, you also realize how feeble the legal and social standing of the native Algerian population is now in this predominantly French arrangement. And it's this psychological, emotional aspect of colonialism that is so damaging to the psyche of the the native, if you want to call them that way. Something that Frantz Fanon, in this very important book, Les Damnés de la Terre, describes. Fanon is a medical doctor from another French colony who comes to Algeria just at the outset of the War of Independence, and he sees the extreme brutality of French warfare as it tries to subjugate the struggle for independence. But more importantly, he looks at the way the local population is now becoming dispossessed of its identity. And I invite you to read his book, because it continues to be one of the most crippling descriptions of that emotional impact of colonialism, quite apart from the political impact. In economic terms, as you can imagine, the settler economy, this leads to a shift from subsistence agriculture to cash crops, to the dispossession of locals, and with the shift to cash crops come the imposition of taxes to be paid in currency, and which leads to a further immiseration of local populations. And with this dramatic transformation of agriculture, the economy, and social relations comes something that is unexpected by the colonial powers, but it should not surprise us looking at this situation in hindsight, is the resistance of the local populations. It begins with the mountainous tribes in the Kabylie, but it's these people that were historically remote and historically opposed to the central authorities that are now at the beginning of national resistance. But here we see that quickly it spreads to the rest of the population. And here in this painting we see on the left is a woman from the Kabylie in traditional garment, and on the right side of the picture you see Lala Fatma Soumer, who is one of the female leaders of resistance to French colonialism already in the 19th century, in 1851 till 57. So resistance is not something that is only starting in the 20th century. It's there from the outset of the colonial dispossession of natives. Let's look quickly at the impact of French or colonial law and administration that's now brought into these countries. As you can imagine, the impact is strongest in Algeria. Algeria is fully integrated into French society and the French state system, so French laws and civil and government institutions are transposed lock, stock and barrel to Algeria. In Tunisia and Morocco, the impact is more nuanced. France introduces in Morocco and in Tunisia a three-tier court system where you have the traditional Muslim courts, you now have state courts applying French state law and being jointly manned with French colonial officers, and then you have the Berber courts that the French introduced to cement this ethnic division that exists between the Arabs and the Berbers. And here on this you see a map of French Algeria as they saw it. And you have in all three countries, therefore, a legacy of secular French institutions that continue into the 20th century and that are now very difficult to turn back to. Here on this picture you see the current Constitutional Assembly and the representatives of the Islamist party Al-Nahda in Tunisia in the National Assembly in Tunisia. So important to remember here is the what I call the path dependency of French, the continuation of French colonial institutions that they set up and that they now continue to have a life on their own, quite independently of the political movements that then spring up in the 20th century in these countries. And you might have noted now that I have downplayed the Spanish colonial legacy simply because the Spanish state was not as strong as the French state. So its colonial legacy in Morocco was much more muted than the French legacy. And the same holds true for Libya under Italy. I mean, the Italian colonial presence was much less formalized, much less successful in transposing and transforming these populations. Let's now briefly look at the period when this colonial presence ends, the wars of liberation that exist and the autocratic governments that they give rise to. I'd mentioned already that particularly in the French territories, very large numbers of people were drafted into the French army to fight in the European wars, that particularly the First World War and the Second World War. And there was a strong expectation of reward for this sacrifice. And we see particularly in World War II, when France, mainland France, becomes occupied by German troops, the North African colonial possessions remain loyal to Free France. And there was a strong expectation that this loyalty to the French Republic would be rewarded once the war was concluded, and that the fact that the independence movements did not abuse or use the moment of weakness in which France found itself to, for example, push for independence or strike a deal with their German enemies, that this would be rewarded afterwards. And General de Gaulle, who was the leader of the Free French during the Second World War, publicly admitted this during the war and said that France owed it a duty of gratitude for the loyalty that the Muslim populations of North Africa showed towards it. But as we see, once the Second World War concludes, France does not deal in a constructive manner with these demands for independence. It's relatively muted in Morocco, where they come, as I said before, there is a continuation of the dynasty, so it's a devolution of colonial authority back to the central, the local monarchy. And the same we will see in Tunisia, where a republic is established and a gradual devolution of colonial authority to the Tunisian authorities is contemplated and is put into motion. With Algeria, however, France insisting on this colonial dogma that Algeria is not a colony but an integral part of France, we see an extremely brutal attempt at suppression of this nationalist movement. Here we see the French Foreign Legion in Algeria. And what is now characteristic of the Algerian War of Independence, that is fought from 1954 till 1962, is the extreme degree of brutality in which the French military authorities try to break the spirit of the Algerian population, which, not surprisingly, leads to a similar degree of brutality on the side of the National Liberation Movement in Algeria. And difficult for us now to contemplate, but the very large numbers of casualties suffered during the Algerian War of Independence. The figures vary a little bit, but we can easily assume that about 675,000 people lost their lives in the Algerian War for Independence. And more importantly is the very, very widespread use of extremely pervasive torture, particularly by the French troops, something that is thematized in a very graphic and very instructive manner in the film La Bataille d'Alger, for which you see here the poster. And I invite you to see this movie, which is certainly not a family movie, but it gives you a sense of the polarization that now exists. The very high degree of violence and political agitation that now exists between the French settlers and their supporters in France and the Algerian liberation movement is now affecting both societies very dramatically, both in mainland France and in colonial Algeria. There are now attempts to subvert the order, both, and not only by the Algerian liberation movement, but also we see now French, particularly the settler organizations, who are now trying to attack the integrity of the French state, leading to the actual coup d'etat attempt by the military organization of the settlers, the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète under General Massu. This instability in France is only resolved when the French Fourth Republic collapses. A new tailor-made Fifth Republic with vastly expanded presidential powers is created, and General de Gaulle is called back from retirement, assumes the presidency of the Fifth Republic, and suppresses the domestic French resistance, breaks these mutinous soldiers, and eventually enters into negotiations that lead to the Evian Accords. Here on this picture you see the lovely French spa town of Evian, where the Algerian War of Liberation formally is ended, and Algeria is given, or it's not given, it's France recognizes the independence that Algeria has fought for itself. And as you can imagine, as a third world country now that has, with the rifle in their hands, fought down a colonial power, and a very great colonial power, the FLN, the Algerian Liberation Movement, is now endowed with a very large degree of political capital and standing throughout the developing world. Here in this picture you see the FLN football team being welcomed in Vietnam, in revolutionary Hanoi. And as I had already pointed out, the polarization of the War of Independence leads to very large numbers of revenge killings after independence. We are talking about 150,000 collaborators or alleged collaborators that are now killed and by the victorious FLN. And one thing for you to remember, and I think that's is important, that a conflict of that size, of that degree of violence, these large numbers of casualties suffered, that leaves a legacy that has poisoned relations in Algeria for decades to come. I invite you to come back to the next video, in which we will talk about the Ottoman and colonial history and some of these past dependencies as they develop, not least with respect to Italian colonialism in some parts of Africa.